Thanks, Deb. Prophetic women, what about you, my friend? And prophetic men, what about Russ? I think part of the role of prophetic nuns is to spread the joy of being prophetic with everyone. And I'm very, very proud to be in the FutureChurch family. And actually, this talk tonight and all of this research came because of pilgrimages that I led to Rome in search of women in the early church, which we could hardly ever find out about because they're pretty invisible in the written record. But thankfully, to the groundbreaking work of wonderful scholars like Carolyn Osiek, Janet Tulloch, and Margaret Y. McDonald, and others, and too many to name, we know much more now than we did before. And I kept asking Janet and Lynn to write this book because we discovered these tombs in the Pio Cristiano Museum that we're going to talk about tonight that I had never seen before, 4th century, with women in proclaiming, teaching postures with biblical stories all around them. And I had never seen them before. And I said, don't you think you should write about this? And they'd say, no, we don't want to do that. So I thought, well, dang, then I'm going to write about it. And thankfully, both Lynn and Janet were very helpful in the preparation of the book. I'm going to put this on screen share. Well, let me see, we'll put this on presenter. And then, well, no, that didn't work. I have to put on screen share first. Okay, and then presenter. So, because I don't want to take too much more time talking about, are we good? Can you see the title? Okay, good. So this is the cover of the book. And I always like to do a little commercial for the Theresa Kane book also, because it came out right at the same time as COVID, and we didn't do so great with being able to get out and market it, but it's a wonderful, she's such a wonderful woman that I don't want to lose her story. As many of you know, she was the one who said to the Pope in 1979, we need to open all the ministries of the church to women. She was speaking as president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious and as of the Sisters of Mercy. So anyway, it's a wonderful story, and it's as much a story of the Sisters of Mercy almost as it is of Theresa. Anyway, let's move on to, so tonight, there are 3 main topics that we're going to look at, and we're going to talk about the sociocultural context of early Christianity and the fact that female evangelists and the expansion of Christianity was largely really incredibly enhanced by women. We're also going to take a look at the art and archaeology as sources of information about early Christian women. And we're going to do a deep dive into the whole topic of women and authority as seen on 4th century catacomb frescoes and Christian sarcophagi. So one thing we need to know is that Christianity didn't stay in Israel. In fact, it spread throughout the Greco-Roman Empire, and this map sort of tells you where things were in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. And Greco-Roman culture was all over. The Romans, because of their incredible military, built great roads all over the empire, and it was mostly so they could get their military to the places where there were problems. But a wonderful side effect is that it was very easy and safe to travel throughout the empire. And this was another factor in the rapid spread of Christianity in just 300 years, from being a backwater in Israel and Palestine to, by the end of the 3rd century, becoming first tolerated and then the main religion of the empire, which was remarkable in such a short period of time. So the rapid spread then of the Jesus movement owes a great deal to the initiative of women, particularly from evangelists and missionaries such as Junia, who with her husband Andronicus is called an apostle, foremost among the apostles in Romans 16. Prisca, who with her husband Aquila founded house churches in Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome. Actually, Paul gets the credit, but Prisca and Aquila were there first. And Thecla, who was a really wonderful evangelist and probably one of the great instigators of the prophetic movement in Asia Minor. They were also heads of house churches, such as Lydia in Philippi, who was a businesswoman who had a purple dye trade. Again, Prisca and Nympha in Laodicea. There were widows such as Grapte, we'll hear more about her, and Tabitha, who we just heard about, I think several days ago in our daily readings, who was a leader of widows and much beloved in Joppa, that we remember Peter raised her, but from the dead. And but she was a very important female leader in the early church. And some scholars feel she may have been another person in Jesus' Galilean discipleship, which is why Peter rushed over there so quick, because he knew her. And then of course there's prophets, Philip's prophetic daughters in Acts, and Maximilla and other female prophets. I'm just going to run through a bit of the history from the literary record because it gives us good context for the archaeology. The other thing behind the spread of the Jesus movement was financial support from wealthy Christian women and business women. This is one of those very little to unknown facts, that women of wealth have supported Christianity from the very beginning, starting with Mary of Magdala and Joanna. Mary, the one from Magdala, you will note, is named by the town she's from, not by any relationship to the male patriarchal household. In Luke 8, 1-3, we learn that Mary of Magdala, Joanna, Susanna, and quote, many other women accompanied Jesus around his Galilee and provided for them from their resources. Now, in my sort of useful naivete, I thought that meant that they were cooking meals for them, wouldn't that be good? But in fact, biblical scholars say Mary, the one from Magdala, is probably a woman of considerable wealth because she's named in her own right. Magdala was also a very wealthy fishery town. And Joanna was the wife of Herod's steward, Chusa. Herod was the king. So Joanna also had wealth. And scholars tell us providing for them from their resources really means they were financially underwriting Jesus' Galilean mission. And of course, in ancient Israel, observant Jewish men did not speak to women outside their own families in public. And so Jesus, in his own way, was very countercultural by including women in his discipleship. Admittedly, things were a little looser in Galilee than they were in Jerusalem, but nonetheless, the biblical record is clear that it wasn't just Jesus and 12 men going around Galilee doing good. It was also women learning from Jesus what it meant to be about proclaiming the reign of God that was coming into the world in a new way through Jesus. There's also Lydia, who acts the purple dye trader. She was from Thyatira. Purple dye was very expensive, and she was a woman of means. She had a big house. She invited Paul and the other disciples to her home after her conversion in Philippi. Phoebe, Romans 8, 16, 1-2 is somehow completely deleted from the lectionary. Don't get me going, that's a whole other talk. But she is not only a deacon, a diakonos, which is the same word Paul uses to describe his own ministry. She is also a prostatis. And Lynn Osick says that prostatis means a benefactor, and that was probably the more important of Phoebe's titles, because she also supported Paul's itinerant, evangelizing mission. I'm sorry, I keep doing this. And then Olympias is a 4th century deacon of incredible wealth who probably subsidized just about every bishop in Asia Minor. She was in Constantinople and started a whole monastery. She was a female deacon. And there's many other examples. You can read the book if you really get into this, okay? So here's the ultimate contemporary word on this came from none other than Pope Benedict XVI, who on February 14th noted that the history of Christianity would have turned out very differently without the contribution of women. The female presence, he said, was anything but secondary. Now, he's arguably among the most erudite of popes. He's not exactly a poster child for feminism in the Catholic Church, but he was a good enough scholar to know how important women were to early Christianity. Women were anything but secondary. That meant they were either on a par with the male presence or even better. So anyway, early house churches were led by women of status such as Grapte. She's one of those, another name that we never hear, a 2nd century leader of communities of widows and orphans in Rome. The Shepherd of Hermas is one of the earliest Christian writings, which tells the story of Hermas, who sees a vision of a divine person, who tells him to write his vision down and make 2 copies and take one to Clement in Rome and one to Grapte. These are the 2 leaders in the Roman Church in the early mid-2nd century. Clement is often remembered, Grapte is not. Clement was not a pope. The Roman Church actually was the last one to get a monarchical episcopacy, but that's another talk. Anyway, Grapte was one of the 2 main leaders in Rome in the earliest, 2nd century. So through the house church, early Christians gained access then to social networks that brought them into contact with people from very different social classes. For example, when a female head of household, perhaps a wealthy businesswoman such as Lydia, converted to Christianity, Christian evangelists such as Prisca or Paul gained access not only to Lydia's own household, but also to her patronage network. And again, as a purple dye trader, Lydia had a huge network of business contacts that was sort of how Christianity spread. Most Christians women were probably freeborn or freed persons. They were able to acquire wealth, contrary to sort of preconceptions. They were not barefoot pregnant and chained to the stove all the time. Because not only wealth, but they also then acquired status. And that was a very important cachet in the Roman patronage social system. And they gained this through small business enterprises, such as processing wool, trading in purple dye, such as Lydia, leather work and tent making, such as Prisca, and things like that. Carolyn Osiek and Margaret Y. MacDonald note in their wonderful book, A Woman's Place, that, quote, lower class Christian women had money, high status, and freedom of movement, especially throughout the extended household of antiquity. So Celsus, who was an early leader, actually an early critic of Christianity, had strongly criticized Christianity as the very heart of a troublesome new movement. He said Christians convinced the foolish, the dishonorable, the stupid, and slaves and little children to leave their father and their schoolmasters and go along with the women and little children who are playfellows to the women's apartments, the wool dresser's shop, or the cobbler's or the washerwoman's shop. And so Celsus' critique actually coincides. So it's sometimes from the criticism that you get an idea of what this early movement was like. And it coincides with evidence from early Christian writings that the Jesus movement, in fact, expanded through house churches and small business networks, such as those of Lydia, Prisca, Grapte, and Paul. Evangelization, therefore, was conducted person to person, house to house, by women who reached out to other women, freed persons, and slaves. The Jesus movement's wholehearted embrace of an egalitarian social ethos, therefore, particularly with regard to the leadership of women, even slave women. In Asia Minor, Pliny wrote to Trajan wanting to know what to do about these two Christian slave women who were called ministra. And that's evidence that female slaves actually held leadership roles in early Christianity. So the fact that this was happening was very shocking to more than a few in the broader Greco-Roman culture. Women's public leadership was unsettling to mainstream understandings of women's roles. And these were based on what we call Greco-Roman household codes, which had very, strict ideas about gendered ideas about what were appropriate places for women. And it was not in the public space. It was only within the domestic space. And so, plus the other thing about the household codes is that it's the father, the paterfamilias, rules the roost. And so everybody in the household, the wife, the children are all subservient to what the father wants. And with Christianity's sort of challenge to, I guess you would say, patriarchal norms, the Romans were very superstitious, and they sort of believed that as the family went, so went the empire. So here you have these Christians with women saying, no, I'm not going to marry some 40-year-old guy who's had 4 other spouses. I'm going to embrace celibacy, like Paul said. And suddenly it led to persecution of Christianity. And that's the third point here, that Paul's valuation of celibacy and its embrace by many women undermined patriarchal marriage, which was mandatory pretty much in the empire because Rome wanted everybody to be having babies. So you just didn't, and plus not to mention the fact that as throughout history, women were bargaining chips to expand the wealth of the patriarchal household. So from the early 2nd century to the early 5th century, male church leaders then repeatedly cited 1 Timothy's admonishment, women are to be silent in the churches, as justification for curtailing female authority. Now, biblical scholars are pretty united in their assessment that 1 Timothy was not written by Paul, but much later in the Pauline school. And, there's just too many internal contradictions for Timothy saying women be silent and Paul saying elsewhere in Corinthians, women, when you prophesy, make sure you cover your heads. So you've got women, anyway, that's another talk. Anyway, Christian women and a few good men took initiative outside of patriarchal norms because of their belief in Jesus. And so we see that women's countercultural exercise of authority in the context of everyday domestic life is an often unheralded key to Christianity's rapid expansion. Despite official sanctions, women persisted in teaching, preaching, evangelizing, and baptizing. So there were 3 significant differences between 1st and 4th century Roman society that can be attributed to the exercise of female ecclesial authority. Now, these are the 3 that I recognize. Other people would probably see others, but from doing my study, this is what I came up with. And the first is the freedom to choose a life of celibacy, which effectively dismantled 1 pillar of patriarchy, which is mandatory marriage. Now, this seems odd to us in the 21st century, but we live in a different world than the first 4 centuries. The second is that Christian widows and virgins, we didn't talk about this too much, but people like Tabitha, Grapte, the widows and orphans in Rome, anyway, the widows and virgins rescued, socialized, baptized, and educated thousands of orphans who would otherwise have died of exposure or been doomed to prostitution. And this came from the Roman practice, the paterfamilias, who was free, by the way, to have sexual relations with everybody in his household, the women, the men, the female slaves, the male slaves. And the any offspring would have to be approved by the pater familias. And if he rejected them, then they were put out by the wayside. Hopefully someone would pick them up. And usually someone did, but then then they had to become prostitutes. Well, the widows, the women, the Christian women rescued these orphans and saved them from that. And actually, that was another thing that actually changed the Roman Empire, because by the early 6th century, this practice of exposing children was outlawed in Christianity. Anyway, the third point is that the domestic networking and evangelization activities of women played a leading role, and this is the most important point for our purposes, in transforming Roman society from a predominantly pagan to a predominantly Christian culture. Okay, we'll take a breath for a minute, because now we're going to move to some of the visual evidence that the stuff that we can find from the visuals. So, as I mentioned earlier, the presence of female leaders and patrons is barely discernible in early Christian literary sources. So, therefore, visual imagery and artifacts from tombs provide information about women in the early church that is either not available or not infrequently, I'm sorry to say, distorted in the written history. And that's why this kind of study has gotten to be pretty popular and important. Now, one thing is important, the people who studied Roman funerary art tell us that there were certain purposes. The sarcophagus for the ordinary Roman was a monument filled with meaning. It was not just a container for a corpse. So the funerary art was meant to construct the idea or the identity of the deceased. It was meant to commemorate the values and virtues of the deceased, and it provided information about the deceased as role models, and that's from Janet Husbandson. And this is the basis for why we are able to say something about, you know, what the art meant in light of the tomb art of the early Christian woman or the early Roman, non-Christian Roman woman. So Christian funerary art, though, did come from how the Romans came from their own conventions, their own Roman funerary conventions. And this is just a very elaborate, very expensive marble sarcophagus of this couple right here. This is a mythological sarcophagus, and it portrays the war between the Greeks and the Amazons, in which Achilles here, who is the leader of the Greeks, he wins the war and slays Penthesilea, who is the leader of the Amazons. And as the myth goes, as he slays her and gazes into her face as she's dying, and here's a close-up of it, he's not really gazing in his face, but the myth is that he falls in love with her, okay? So this seems like a sort of a weird kind of thing to put on your tomb, but to the Roman mind, this is a way of saying something about the undying nature of the love between the couple who chose to have this art on their sarcophagus. So mythological sarcophagi were very big. They were in the late 1st to late 2nd century. But then into the late 2nd, early 3rd century, we see more sophistic period of Roman sarcophagi, Roman tombs. And by that is meant philosophy. Philosophy was hugely important in Roman culture. It was a sign of status, and it was signified by people holding scrolls. And it said right away that they were literate and that they were learned, and that philosophy was almost like a religion in many ways in Roman culture. So this tomb shows this woman with a scroll, and on either side of her engaging in discourse. I sort of think this was her husband. One of the descriptors said they were philosophers, but usually philosophers are depicted without clothing or very minimally dressed because they eschewed any, public display of wealth. Anyway, I sort of think this was her family. But the point being that this woman or her family showed her as a woman of learning and so she would be greatly esteemed. And again, this was a hugely expensive tomb. Here's another, and just to give you some flavor of how the Romans used their tomb art to say something about the deceased. This is the sarcophagus of a deceased woman, and this is her husband. And with this family chose to show this couple in the context of muses. And the muse figure, it was very popular in Roman culture. These are the sources of inspiration for music, for art, for play acting, for writing, for poetry. And there's usually 9 muses, and the muses are always shown standing, okay? And I say this just because a little thing, the Orans figure that became, or the prayer figure that became so popular in later Christianity, derived actually from the muse. Okay, so anyway, there's 9 muses, and in this picture we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muses. Huh, what's that about? Well, here is the 9th muse, and this is this gentleman's wife holding a harp of some sort. And so this art is saying this woman was my inspiration, okay? So you sort of get the idea about how Romans used the important things in their culture to say something about the values and the virtue and the status and the role model of the deceased. So I was very fortunate that at the same time that I was working on this book, a Danish scholar, Stein Burke, had just completed a study of non-Christian portrait sarcophagi from Rome. And she had an estimated 90%. And in her study, she found pretty much an equal number of solo male and solo female portraits on their tombs. So just hold on to that thought. She also found that the most popular self-representation for non-Christian women was a learned portrayal that should be depicted with a scroll. And of 382 female portrait sarcophagi, 160 commemorated them through a learned female figure, and that was pretty much equivalent to how the men were portrayed. So again, in the Roman sarcophagi, both women and men were portrayed pretty equally. Okay, so let's turn now to Christian funerary art. I hope you're hanging in there. That's why I put all this on slides. I thought it would be easier to follow that way. Anyway, Christian funerary art, it provides information about how early Christian women and men self-identified. It provides information about how they were viewed by their families and their friends. It also provides evidence that early Christian women, as well as men, were role models, and we'll get into that. So I'm just going to take a few frescoes and then we'll spend the time on the 4th century tombs. But this is a wonderful fresco from the catacombs of Domitilla, which actually were donated by a wealthy woman patron, Christian, Domitilla, as a site to bury Christians when they died. It's dated to the late 4th, early 5th century. And as we can see, the painting shows 2 women dressed in clothing from 2 different historical periods. This woman with the wide sleeves and the veil is Veneranda, she who is to be venerated, it's her tomb. Next to her is Petronilla, and Veneranda is dressed in late 4th century style of clothing. Petronilla, however, is dated in dressed in a much earlier style with the toga, no veil, and it says Petronilla, martyr, okay? Next to them are signs of their ministry. A codex with streams is typical for how scriptures were represented in a 4th century rendition of the Gospels. And this latter thing, this basket, is called a capsa, and with the shoulder strap. And in the early centuries, we didn't have the Gospels written down in books, and sometimes we didn't have them written down. We also had the Hebrew scriptures. And so the early evangelists carried these texts around with them in this portable basket. So both of them had, so there's a way that there was all this debate about who Petronilla is. For a long time, they thought it was Peter's daughter, but in fact, there's no really decent evidence to that effect. It's much more likely that Petronilla was, there's no evidence that Peter's daughter in the early text was a martyr, for one thing, but it's much more likely that Petronilla took her name from the cognomen Petronius, who there was a very prominent family. And because there's this whole thing about how you figure out who's a martyr, and most catacombs experts believe that there was no evidence, her name doesn't appear in the 4th century Roman calendar of feasts, the Depositio Martyrium, and which supports a late 1st or early 2nd century dating of Petronilla's martyrdom. But because she does not appear, another excellent scholar, Nicola Denzi, felt that her absence, she really showed the disconnection between whom people actually venerated and whom Rome's bishops would advocate for veneration, and it may have been gendered. So the official list is dominated by male saints, and with only 4 of the 46 being recognized as women. Veneranda's painting on her tomb suggests that even in 354, or the late 4th century, the memory traditions of unrecognized martyrs such as Petronilla still lay in the hands of women. And I think the art would let us know that Veneranda clearly identified her ministry as a woman of the word, if you will, with that of Petronilla as a woman of the word. And if you're thinking I'm crazy about the capsa being a sign of authority, here we have Paul in the same catacomb right around the corner with his capsa. Only here it's called a sign of the doctrine. Anyway, there's more analysis in the book if you're interested. This is Battaglia in Pace. It's a 4th to 5th century painting from the catacombs of San Januarius in Naples. And she also is remembered for her service as a ministry of the word. Above her, she has 2 codices with streamers hanging down, Joannes, Marcus, and Matthias. Dorothy Irving, and this says Battaglia in Pace. Dorothy Irving believes that, and others believe that this is sort of a rendition of a cup, and because she's standing at a table, she could be presiding at Eucharist, which you, in my own belief, you really can't tell what roles, ordination roles, formal roles people held from the art, but you can tell what titles they held from inscriptions. And during the same time period, there are numerous inscriptions that have women with the presbytera title. You have Lita the presbytera, Kale the presbyter, and others. So it's not impossible, but I just don't think you can say it from the art itself, is my own belief. And here's another similar one, Charula in Pace, also at San Januarius in Naples. And this is even more notable because it's got a Christogram, again with the 2 codices, the screamers. But I want to point out something very special about this. And this is this acclaiming figure here, which has a long, narrow face, pointy beard. This is Paul, who's always often portrayed in this way. On this side, though you can't see it, was probably Peter, also with an in-facing, acclaiming posture. And we'll talk about more of that in a minute. This is the Phroxiopanus detail at the catacombs of Priscilla, that for a long time, people were saying these were all men, when in fact, there's all kinds of evidence with the veil and the earring that these were women. Early, they said it was a Eucharist, but now most scholars believe it was a funerary meal. But what seems obvious is these are a group of women at prayer. And this is the room itself where the fresco is located, and it is a place where women would come and pray, because we've got other images of Susanna and other women on the walls. I'm trying not to get too sidetracked, but okay, so now let's get to Crispina. And as we see, this is her, I chose this for the cover of the book because it's one of the few women we have a name for actually on the sarcophagi. There's a Christogram here on the codex that she's holding. She's sort of cradling it. And then the next one is the rest. This is a lid. The left half of the lid is not available, but there are two sort of unidentified men here, but no, one of them is holding a scroll with a speech gesture. Here's Jesus with the multiplication of the loaves. There's an arrest of Peter, and Peter baptizing his jailer with water from a rock. Now, these latter two depictions are not from the Gospels or from the New Testament. They are from the Acts of Peter. But we have to remember, Peter was very popular. This is Rome. And so this story shows up on quite a few tombs. In any case, this is another image of a mid-4th century free sarcophagus, in which a woman here is holding a codex with her hands in a speech gesture. Okay, I'm just trying to give you some idea of what these images are. Anyway, she's got her hands in a speech gesture with a codex, and what else? Well, on either side of them are stories from the New Testament. On her left, which is the healing of the blind man, the multiplication of the loaves, Jesus' triumphal entry into Israel. And then to her right and our left, this is probably the raising of the Ezekiel raising the dead bones, though some think it could be the widow of Nain. This is Peter's arrest and the jailers. Now, just note, though, how many of these folks are holding scrolls, okay? So, including Jesus here. So, again, Christians, it was very important for them to be portrayed in their tomb art as literate. But also, it was very important for this woman to be shown in her tomb art as proclaiming good news. And by the way, this little wand here, the Romans didn't have any category for miracle. They only had a category for magic. So Jesus is often shown with this wand. This is another woman who doesn't have her hands in a speech gesture, but her mouth is open, which says something about her tomb. And she is also holding a scroll. And on either side, again, this is the nativity. This is the baptism of Jesus on our right. This is the raising of the widow of the daughter of the widow of the daughter of Jairus' daughter, sorry. And on the left side, we have, we're not sure what this is. It could be Peter's denial, but in any case, this is Jesus being taken by the soldiers before Caiaphas. And we know it's Caiaphas because of his little yarmulke there. Okay, so just to show you how the Christians also work their own stories, this is the healing of Jairus' daughter. This is Jesus. This is the same woman that was shown in central to the tomb. And what's happening here? Well, the fact is, this is not a little girl on a bed. This is a child wrapped in a shroud in a sarcophagus, because here we have lion feet. So this woman, probably it was her tomb, but it was also her daughter's. And she is in her tomb art expressing her faith that her daughter will be raised through belief in Jesus. Okay, so just now we'll sort of do a run through of my lengthy analysis of all the extant images published in 3 volumes of German scholars, 2,119 images I looked at. I recorded 762 of those images in a database. Many had no carvings or fragments or anything. I was very strict in how I defined what was a Christian sarcophagus. And this database by the Germans, by the way, these books were, in their view, they were all Christian. I was stricter in how I defined it. I would not say that unless they had biblical figures. Anyway, I found 558. And of those, I found 312 portraits on 247 tombs. And that means a portrait is a depiction of the deceased. And ta-da, this was the thing I never expected. We found 3 times as many solo female portraits compared to solo male portraits on the early Christian tombs. It was significant. The likelihood that the difference was due to chance was just 1 in 1,000. So this was the big surprise. And I just want to remind you that of the non-Christian portrait sarcophagi in Rome, Steinberg's study, there were equal numbers of women and men portraits on Roman tombs, but not so on the Christian tombs. So right now, because it takes a lot of money to have one of these tombs, it tells you right there that many women were wealthier and more prominent, at least in the 4th century, than Christian men. Okay, from a status societal point of view. So then I looked at all the signs of learnedness, and that's scrolls, codexes, scroll bundles. There was no significant differences between male and female portrayals. One interesting thing is that in the pagan tombs, the non-Christian tombs, the male of couple depictions on non-Christian tombs, the male is always shown holding the scroll or the sign of status. The female is never shown that, holding it. However, on the Christian tombs, which I don't think I emphasized enough when I saw it, we found 6 women in the couple depictions who were holding scrolls. And one of them was the deceased Eugenius, who died at 57 years old and had, after 41 years of marriage, leaving 4 surviving children. In this depiction, her husband is in the orans posture, and she is shown holding a codex with a scroll. Here's a casket, the projector casket at the British Museum of, and the central tondo. There was some debate whether this was Christian or not, but in the fact that the woman is holding the scroll and the man is not, there was a Christian inscription on the side, but it was also with Venus and many of the goddesses on it. You can be pretty sure that this was a Christian thing. So then I looked at portraits with speech gestures. There was no significant difference between male and female. And again, that's the speech gesture you can see. And then I looked at portraits that have both the scroll and capsa, sign of learnedness, and a speech gesture, and there was no significant difference between portrayals of men and women there. And if you're wondering about the authority piece, this is a window that was built in 1950 in a church in Cleveland showing Pius X with his hands in a speech gesture and holding a book or a codex. So you can see how this art depictions come down through history. It's very fascinating. Okay, next we're going to talk a bit about the orans posture or a prayer posture. And again, it derived from the muse. This is from a tomb in France, actually, that is now being used as a flower box outside of a chateau. But I loved it, so I really worked hard. Anyway, this is a box, a scriptorium, which holds scrolls. So she has both learned and prayer postures. And oops, guess what? We've got in-facing, acclaiming apostle figures on this tomb. And here's another orans portrait of a very prominent, the most illustrious woman, Marcia Romana Salsa from Arles. Her husband was consul at Arles. You can see she's also, portrayed with a scroll bundle at her feet and 2 in-facing apostles who have introducing gestures, okay? I don't have time to go through all the things, but just to show you how elaborate her tomb was. So to do the female orans, they outnumbered the male orans by 8 to 1. which again is probably not too surprising because, as I said, the prayer posture derived from the standing muse figure. For a long time, art historians said, because there were so many female orans everywhere, the male archaeologists couldn't quite believe that these were all women. So they said, oh no, this was a depiction of the soul. But so I had to spend a lot of time in this study showing that each of these figures had distinguishing features like jewelry and hairstyles, and they were in fact portraits of deceased women. So again, this was a hugely significant difference. The thing that was probably significant is that so many men chose that posture for themselves as well. And here you see a male bust over a female body, which is saying, the men were using the women as role models, the Orans. Here's another depiction of the two brothers sarcophagus. And again, this was originally a couple. You can sort of see the breast here and with the female, but with the speech gesture in that one. That's just a little aside. So then I looked at all learned portraits because the Orans, because it was derived from a muse, was also thought to be a learned and posture. And there were no significant differences between male and female. Now we come to one of the most, I'm going to say it was one of the original discoveries that I made. And that is the in-facing apostle figure. And here you see a woman. And this was the first one that actually caught my eye because we have a woman with a scroll and these two men looking at her rather intently. And then right down the aisle at the Pio Cristiano, there we have a picture of Jesus holding a scroll with these two disciple figures looking at him. And then, here's another one with Jesus. You can't really see the scroll too much because it's broken off, but it's here. Again, two disciples looking intently at Jesus. Come to find out, Felicity Hurley, who's a very well-known historian of Roman art, says that this frieze from the sarcophagus of what they call it Plotinus, but they don't really know who it is. But this art became the model for how early Christian art portrayed authority. And you can see a gentleman seated with a scroll and the two in-facing figures. So that became iconic. So I did a study of this and found that of the in-facing apostle authority depictions, interestingly enough, the female portraits outnumber the males by 7-1. Again, very significant. Here's an example of on the sarcophagus of Sabino. Again, a woman here in orans with in-facing figures. She's up here again with holding a scroll. And here's yet another one this is at Notre Dame in France. And again, a woman in an orans. And again, you can see the different jewelry, etc. And one more different depiction. So what was this in-facing thing all about anyway? Well, some scholars said that the accompanying figures were accompanying the deceased into paradise. And someone else said, well, they're sort of just filler figures. Okay, so I need to go back, sorry. The fact was though, 73 women were in that posture, 10 were men, and then we had 166 images of Christ shown in that posture. So surely Christ did not need apostle figures accompanied him into paradise. So my deduction, therefore, was that because women were being told to be silent and not to teach, our 4th century women felt they needed the authority of the apostles to back up their authority to preach and to teach and to evangelize. So it's the female tomb iconography compared with, I want to now take a moment and compare the tomb iconography of 4th century women with what we know about 4th century women from literary sources. And we find remarkable corroboration about the women whose portraits are found in early Christian sarcophagi. These are tomb women who were well educated, they were wealthy, they were wives, mothers, and judging from the number of solo female tombs, they were single women or widows. The funerary iconography indicates that at the least they proclaimed or taught scripture. And when you do a review of the literary sources, which I do sort of in the last chapter of the book, these attest that women such as Marcella, Macrina, Egeria, Melania the Elder, Melania the Younger, Marthana, Proba, and others were wealthy, well-educated, married, and single women. And let me just give a few examples. Marcella started sort of a 4th century study group on the Aventine in Rome. But when Jerome departed for Bethlehem, and they were all about scripture studies, and of course, if it's Jerome, it would be. When he departed for Bethlehem, the priests in Rome turned to Marcella for scripture interpretation. And she also publicly debated church men on the Origenist controversy in Rome. Melania the Elder exercised a discerning, loving spiritual authority that included reconciling schismatic monks, leading a prominent churchman back to his vow of celibacy, teaching and converting men. And she was instrumental in resolving a schism at Antioch that involved, quote, some 400 monks. She was a formidable scholar, well-versed in Christian theological and probably some classical works. And then Olympia the deacon. So basically, women, these 4th century women were lovers of scripture and scholars who taught both women and men. These early mothers of the church exercised authority at a time when the fathers of the church forbade women to speak or teach publicly, preferred that women stay at home, and judged women more susceptible to heresy than men. Yet the Christian women of the 4th century did not keep silent or remain enclosed. They spoke up about important ecclesial issues. They taught both men and women. They served the marginalized. They witnessed freely about the Christ with whom they had thrown in their lot. And judging from the regular proscriptions from church fathers, quote unquote, the criticisms from church fathers, which means they were telling them not to do this, which meant that they were doing it, women also regularly baptized and celebrated the Eucharist. So I don't want to lose some of the, in all the words, I don't want to lose the meaning of what reflection on one of these early tombs, what that experience would have been like. So just bear with me for a minute because I'm going to read from a certain part of the book. And this is a tomb of a woman that we don't know her real name, but I have called her Junia. And so let's just walk through what this experience would have been like for the early Christian community. Several years before she died, Junia or her family commissioned this uniquely sculpted sarcophagus to memorialize her and the values that shaped her identity. When Junia died, her sarcophagus was delivered to her home, where she would lie in state for up to 7 days, so family members, clients, and friends could pay their respects and gazed upon her carefully carved memorial. They would enter a liminal space to reflect upon her life, her values, her beliefs, and inevitably the meaning of life and death. So what I would like to, so just take a moment here and take a look at what is on Junia's tomb. Well, here she is in the center with a codex, her hands in a speech gesture. To our right and her left, this is Jesus healing the paralytic, healing the man born blind, Jesus with the miracle at Cana, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And right here was either, depending on how they just chose to describe, the German analysts chose to describe it, either Martha or Mary kneeling at Jesus' feet. Actually, this looks very like Junia, okay, the same kind of configuration. To our left, this is Adam and Eve, and this is Cain and Abel bringing the first fruits to God the Father. Okay, so these are the biblical stories that Junia or her family chose for her tomb. So again, as her family and friends gathered around, they entered this liminal space to reflect on her life and values and her beliefs. Janet Tulloch, a specialist in early Christian images, has observed that ancient art was viewed as social discourse meant to, quote, draw in the viewer as a participant, and that art was understood, quote, to perform meanings and not simply to embed them. So using Tulloch's criteria, it's plausible that Junia wished her loved ones to enter into a liminal space and experience Christ's power to reverse the effects of the fall from paradise, namely healing the blind and lame, providing an abundance of wine in the new reign of God, and raising Lazarus and Junia from the dead. Where did Junia find her authority to witness and teach about Christ? I believe a hint is found in a close-up of her face, which has been carefully sculpted close to the face of Christ, who leans in with mouth open as if to whisper in her ear. Junia and her family wished her to be remembered as someone who taught with the authority of Christ. Her mourners commune not only with the departed Junia, but also with the Christ who heals and raises up through the meaning evoked and performed by the art on her sarcophagus. Junia exhorts the living to embrace the Christ who authorized her ministry and to whom she continues to witness beyond the grave. She joins a sisterhood of Christian women, past and present, who obey an authority that supersedes any who would silence them. Junia is one of countless women who witness that they are made in God's image and called to serve in persona Christi. Amen. In the person of Christ. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Chris. Oh my gosh. So we're going to open this up for questions. And as you are getting your questions ready, Chris, remind us of what that speech gesture means. I'm not sure. Is it
it's just a sign of someone speaking.
Okay.
It derives from plays, ancient plays. You know, they'd have the odium or the big amphitheater, and the Romans loved plays, and they were putting on all the different Greek plays and everything. But so they developed a whole code of, since you couldn't always hear everything, they developed a code. So the nearest they can tell is it just means someone speaking aloud, someone speaking out loud.
Okay, very good. So if you have a question,
for the question.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can use the little symbol and raise your hand, or you can do this. I'll see you. Let's take a few. Let's see here. We've got Frank Breen. You have a question.
Yes, we've been discussing this among ourselves. I'm a Marino priest.
Good.
Just one simple thing. Can it be argued that Mary was not the only one from Magdala? That there were probably other single women who went to Magdala because they could make an income and live. And that maybe they had developed some kind of a network, a group of women, Galilean women, who were seeking some kind of liberation from the patriarchal structures. And that there may have been a Galilean, this is what I'm positing. I don't know if I can make it. a Galilean women's liberation movement in Magdala that joined with this other group, men from Capernaum, which is pretty close, and that there were two movements that combined together. Can I make that argument, or am I out in left field somewhere?
Well, you can make the argument, but I see I would, in my opinion, it's putting the 21st century back on the first century. I think that the big attractor for Mary, the one from Magdala, was Jesus, and we don't know what it was. I mean, the scriptures tell us that he cast 7 demons out of her. And of course, in our 21st century, we think that means she was evil. But in fact, in the first century, all that meant is she had a very serious or a chronic illness, So that was, whatever it was a profound experience for her. And I don't know if anybody's seen the series The Chosen on Amazon Prime, but it's really excellent because it shows, but women were exercising initiative, but within the context of their own culture. So for me, the networking that could have happened, I mean, with Joanna and Mary, the one from Magdala, they may have known each other from various business arrangements. I mean, Chusa was Herod's steward, so the networking that was happening, I think, was primarily probably proprietary through business, through goods and services, through patronage. I mean, the main thing was patronage, and I do think, though, that my own belief is that, and I don't know, would be worth studying, but there was something about Jesus' uncompromising sense of the dignity of every human being, and the importance of justice, and not diminishing the dignity of every human being. He fought, courageously on behalf of a God who loved everyone and who wanted dignity for everyone. And so a lot of his healing was geared to righting some, horrible illness or wrong. And so he would be outraged. He was in the prophetic tradition of Israel. There's a reason why Isaiah is the most quoted prophet in the New Testament. It's because in many ways, Jesus modeled his own ministry. He was a prophet. And even like in the Transfiguration, at the Moses, he was modeling, he's the new Moses, And so the whole thing with the prophetic tradition was, the last shall be first, So I think it was in that context then that was what, in my, what do I want to say, my theological reflection, lighted a fire in the women, but also in the men, but in some ways, even more in the women, because who has experienced more oppression in that culture? As oppressed as the whole culture was, it would have been the women more than the men. So, from that point of view, you could look at it that way, but I'm not so sure about, I would be reluctant to say it was they thought of themselves as a female liberation movement. I think they just knew that this Jesus was proclaiming something new, and it was good news for them that they were equally valued. That would be a good thing to talk about longer. But
thank you, Chris. We have a question in the chat box. It says, did any countries or cultures after the 4th century continue the practice of women teachers and leaders?
Well, actually, there's women deacons right up until the 12th century. So I don't want to, I do think that there were women who had presbyter roles in the early church in the same way that men had presbyter roles. I mean, there were too many Pope Gelasius complaining about it. There were too many churchmen complaining about it. So there is evidence for both female, certainly the female deacons is, you just really can't contest it from a scholarly point of view, but I think there's pretty strong evidence for female presbyters also. Um, and in many ways, once Christianity became okay in the Roman Empire, it was sort of the beginning of the corruption of the leadership of the church in many ways, because the bishops suddenly had access to large amounts of money. And even like Pope Damasus led a war so he could be a pope, and slayed, like, I don't know, 200 followers of the guy who was supposed to be pope against him. And so it really, in many ways, corrupted the early church. The early vision, I don't know, that could be an anachronism also, but I think you have to look at the rise of monastic communities of both women and men in the Egyptian desert, and then also the rise of religious communities of women and men that did continue that prophetic strain in Christianity over against the power predilections of the leadership. That was very much counter to how Jesus instructed the early disciples.
Yeah.
Let no man call you father, serve the people.
Right. The other, another question came up, and I don't know if you've seen or read very much about this. So someone said, well, we understand that some of the current scholarship says Magdala is probably the nickname meaning tower and not necessarily her hometown. Do you have a thought about that, your own research?
Well, yeah, and I think it's on, there are different names for the site of Magdala where we found the first century synagogue, though. So it's hard to know. I don't feel like I have enough. I haven't studied it, especially with some of the new stuff coming up, to know. I do think that she was a real historical person. And because at one point, this is 15 years ago, people were saying that, she was not historical. It was, anyway, I don't want to comment because I feel like I'm out of I haven't done enough research on that, but I thought it was pretty fabulous to find the first century synagogue where supposedly there had been none.
Yeah.
In present day Magdala. So I think the questioning came. So there were several different names for the town that became known as Migdal.
Yeah.
And so, but it's always hard with the naming because depending on the culture, a name can be known in a culture, but not in the literary writing. So I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So I don't see any other hands up right now, and it's 9:13 already. So I think it's probably time to give this a close. I want to really thank you, Chris. As always, it's just extraordinary. So,
thank you all.
Yeah,
for your interest.
So I'm going to turn it over to Russ and let him take us out.